Well, welcome again to Flame of Truth. I'm excited that you're here today. We're starting a new series from the book of Daniel. We did Revelation for a while. Now we're going to do the book of Daniel. I think you'll like it. There's some new ideas. I don't want to just preach the prophecies. We're going to talk about the stories of Daniel and how they work with the prophecies. It's going to be fun. So I'm Dan Smith, the senior pastor of Garden Grove down in Orange County, and just excited to be on LLBN and Flame of Truth. And today we're going to talk about When You're on Your Own from Daniel 1. But first, I want you to hear Stephen Adetumbi, who is going to sing a wonderful song called Midnight Cry.
Of a mighty rushing wind, and it's closer now than it's ever been. I can almost hear the trumpet as a Gabriel sounds the call at the midnight cry. We'll all be going home when Jesus steps out shall rise to meet him in the air. And then those that remain, they'll all be quickly changed. Oh, what a moment! For at the midnight we'll all be going home. I look around me, I see prophecies fulfilling all around. The signs of the time, fulfilling everywhere. I can almost hear the Father say, "Son, go get my children." Oh, it won't be long, for at the midnight cry, oh, for that midnight cry, when King Jesus steps out on a cloud to call his children, the dead in Christ shall rise
thank you, Stephen. I haven't had a chance to hear him before. What an amazing singer and what a great song, The Midnight Cry. Good introduction to Daniel. Daniel 1. You think about how the book of Daniel begins, where it says that Daniel and his friends were dragged from Jerusalem over to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar brought them over. And Nebuchadnezzar takes these young Jews and he lays before them a king's table. I wish I could put before you a king's table. I did it in my church years ago. A king's table. Where Daniel and his friends were offered to eat this incredible food. Is there a king's table in your life? This does not just stand for something to eat that might conflict with your value, anything that conflicts with your deepest core values. It could be pornography. I got a pornographic offer on my computer the other day. I don't even know how to go to pornography on the computer. And all of a sudden, it came to me. Here was this 19-year-old girl in Riverside with her name. It was her birthday, and she was offering all these things that she liked to do. And all I had to do was click, and all those things would be available to me on the computer. King's table. So it could be pornography, it could be movies, it could be music, it could be any kind of addiction, or it could be anger, or pride, or selfishness, or not telling the truth, or sexual sin, anything. That's a king's table that tempts you to go away from the deepest core values that you have chosen in your life. In the first message of Daniel chapter 1, and maybe all of the Bible, but in Daniel, is that we're in a war. It says in Daniel chapter 1, right off the beginning in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God all these vessels that came from the temple. And so Jerusalem and Babylon are symbols of this war. We're in a war. The war that we have here in our country between America and Iraq, or America and Afghanistan, or America and Vietnam, these are small W wars. We're talking about the real war, the capital W war, that great controversy between Christ and Satan. And we're all a part of it. It's a war that none of us can avoid. It's everywhere. I mentioned last week in a message about someone named John Todd. To see a little more about it today, I was in a seminary when this young man, John Todd, went all over the country. And his tapes, cassette tapes had not been around that long, cassette tapes went everywhere. He claimed that he had been in a coven, and that he knew that there were witches everywhere. There were heads, the CEOs of major companies that were witches, and there was a conspiracy behind all of them to take over our country and one world government and new world order. It all went back to the Rothschilds and the Illuminati and the Trilateral Commission. And then behind everything there was witches and conspiracies. And Congress had people who were witches who were running our government. And they were making secret laws to take away our freedoms. And you better start saving up food and have 6 months of food down in your basement. We're in a war. Well, it turned out not to be quite true. But he had one thing right. We're in a war. There is another side that is out to get us, and it's a war over your soul and mind. Revelation 8 and 9, chapters on the trumpets, have the passage about the 200 million locusts coming out of the pit. Those are symbols of Satan and all his demons, and they are spiritual terrorists who live day and night. They never sleep, hatching up strategies to get you away from God and to do something to destroy your soul and take it away from God. We're in a war. I had a chance to go down to a UCLA basketball game here a while ago. A friend of mine has good seats and he knows all the key players. And I was amazed at how similar to a worship service this was. We parked in the parking lot like we do at church. There's a sense of excitement and anticipation as you walk into Pauley Pavilion in the stadium. And all these people, and there's music, and there's people, and they're standing, and they're worshiping. It's a secular religion. and we stood and cheered for our team against the other team. There was a game and a war. And then I went over during halftime, and they introduced me to John Wooden, the famous coach of UCLA, 10 national championships. And I bowed, and I worship, meeting the gods of this game. And I thought about it. We're in a war between religion and secular religion, movies and music, and they have icons and stars and gods and worship and giving. And it's a battle for the soul of people. We're in a war. In Daniel 1, Jerusalem and Babylon are symbols of this war. Number 2 is resiliency. You think about what this battle meant to Daniel and his friends. Daniel and his friends knew the promises that had been given to Abraham, that they would be like sands of the sea, that the whole world would be blessed by their family. He knew the promises in Deuteronomy that Israel would be the head and not the tail, the top and not the bottom. Everyone would owe them money, but they would owe nobody anything. That their crops would be incredible harvests. And all of a sudden, what's happened? Babylon has come over, and Jerusalem has been sacked and destroyed. The temple's gone, the golden vessels are gone, and they are now dragged over the desert 1,000 miles to a pagan country. Where was God? What do you do how you thought things ought to be? We belong to God. We should be blessed. We should be on top. What has happened? And now they're in a pagan country with pagan gods, pagan religion, pagan education, pagan everything. Pagan king's table. What do you do? There's no temple. There's no priest. Their parents are gone. There's no Bible, no school teachers, no pastors. All the things that they were used to are gone and been replaced by pagan. And they were out to reprogram Daniel and his friends. And you have to decide what will happen to you, because there's a culture trying to reprogram you and me. And what are you going to do? And it says in a key verse, Daniel 1 verse 8, Daniel resolved not to eat the king's food. He's not going to do it. He's not going to give in. He will not compromise his core values in order to give in, even though he is 1,000 miles away from his home, his family, his church, and any sign of his God. He will not give in. He will not cut corners. Doesn't matter. Spiritual resiliency. There's a whole theme out there about being a resilient person. You talk about the John McCains of the world who in Vietnam had to be in prison. What do you do when you're in that kind of challenge? Some gave up. Some told the answers to the questions that they were asked. It was too difficult. But there are others who refuse to give in. They refuse to take in the culture that are around them. It doesn't matter if they're in prison camp thousands of miles away from home. They will not give in. They are resilient. They are tough. And they will determine their attitude and who they are, not the surrounding culture. Resilient. Daniel is resilient. He will not take on the culture that is around him. He will not eat at the king's table. He will not take in the paganism in the university. Doesn't matter if life itself is at stake. Spiritually resilient. Daniel resolved not to give in. Refused to compromise his deepest values. You can spend your whole life, if this, or if that hadn't happened, or if that hadn't happened to me, blaming. Or you can say, I will take charge of my life. It doesn't matter what's around me. I will be true. I will stand for what I want to stand for. We all have defining moments that define forks in the road where we're going to go. I've told many times about an experience I had as a young pastor, 25, 26. May have told it on here. You've heard it somewhere I've preached. We had both churches come together to show a movie called Angel in My Pocket, Fred McMurray. And as we got into the movie, it was clear that someone had not previewed this. Even though it was about a pastor and a church, it involved a burlesque scene where women were practicing for a burlesque show, and it was inappropriate. And I was sick that they were showing this in my social night for my churches. But I'd grown up with my mother in Far Eastern Thailand, where I grew up, where whenever there was a movie and a scene that was inappropriate, she would put a card out in front. I kept waiting for someone to do that, but no one did it when I realized it was going to have to be me. I had to slink out of my row, go back, 25, 26 years old, step up to the plate. What are we going to do? Find a card, put it in front, take the heat, and vow that I will never make this mistake again. And I had to grow up a little that night and understand I was now a pastor. I was not a kid waiting for my mother to do something. It was up to me. It was up to me to take a stand. It was up to me to be resilient, to define values when King's tables were put in front of us. What have you done with the King's tables in front of you to be a spiritually resilient person? Number 3, internal morality. Daniel resolved not to eat the king's food. Where do you get your moral values from? Most of us, we grow up with our values from our parents. My boys and I used to watch The Beauty and the Beast. And Gaston, this big, evil, tough being, person, giant in the movie. And so whenever we watch Gaston being violent, I don't like violence, and so I would say, Gaston's not a nice person. We don't want to be like Gaston. And a few days later, I heard my own boys, 2, 3 years old, Gaston's not a nice person. We don't want to be like Gaston. They got their values from me. They were quoting and parroting me. Then later, you get it from your peers, people around you. I can remember being in Chicago at Hinsdale, big hospital, pastoring the church, back when beepers were only the doctors had beepers, and they would have to slip out of a meeting and go answer the phone. And I just wish once I would be important enough where someone would think that I would be so important that if I would need a beeper, and the beeper would go off once, and I would have to be the one to leave a meeting and go call somebody. I wanted to be like the doctors. I wanted to be as important as them. Peer pressure. And so we do what we do. We want to dress like the others, be like the others. I watched my sons, who were 17 and 18, go up to the front of church the other day for some purpose. And out of their pocket were these foot-long lanyards. They have their car keys and their house keys. And I thought, why do they have to do that? Well, because all their friends have a lanyard like that and wear that lanyard out their pocket. That's just the uniform. And we get our values from our peers. And then gradually we learn to get it from other people or from our church. But not Daniel. Daniel can be in Babylon 1,000 miles away from his home, away from his friends, away from his God. It doesn't matter what king's table is put in front of him. He will be true to God. Daniel resolved. He didn't say, my church doesn't let me do this. He didn't even say, my parents really don't allow us to do this, or my school. Daniel resolved himself. He didn't even say, God doesn't let me do this. God had so informed his values that he was going to live right. It didn't matter if it was in the dark. It doesn't matter if he's 1,000 miles away from home. It doesn't matter who was watching. He was not going to compromise. I listened to a story the other day, a pastor friend that I listen a lot to, John Ortberg. He and another couple decided to do something fun. I think it was someone's birthday. They were going to ride in a hot air balloon. He thought that the basket would come up, to like chest level. No, the basket level is at your knees. And all of a sudden, you're 1,000 feet up in the sky. He thought, well, maybe I should get to know this pilot of the balloon. Well, it turns out this was the first time he had ever piloted this particular balloon. He and his brother he decided to get into ballooning. He and his brother had gotten drunk. They'd had an accident, and his brother couldn't do anything anymore, but liked watching balloons, so he became a balloon pilot. And actually had never taken this balloon up and wasn't really sure how he was going to get back down again. A little exciting and a little terrifying. He was an unemployed surfer, and he said, boy, what are we doing in a balloon with this guy? See. And the pastor telling the story said, one of the women that was in the balloon with him said, you're a pastor, do something. Do something religious. And so he said, I took up an offering. Well, that's the joke. But you begin to pray and wish that they had gotten to know who the pilot was a little better. Well, we're all up in the balloon. We're all up in the balloon, and you better know your pilot. You better get your values and your beliefs from the pilot. Get to know who God is. Daniel got his values and his beliefs from God, not from his peers, not from Babylon, not from his parents. He got them from God himself. and he had chosen, this is what I will be. Daniel resolved not to eat the king's food. Number 4, it says, God delivered them to the Babylonians. When you got into chapter 2, it said, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Interesting. I always try to find grace in every passage that we're studying and preaching about. Where do you find grace in this story of Daniel chapter 1 and the king's food? It's like a moral story. Don't eat the king's food. But I think grace is here. It said the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into the king of Judah into his hand. One of the key questions in this war between Christ and Satan is, what is God like, and what is going to happen to sinners? What is God going to do to these people who have resisted him, who say no to him? Because that also tells us something about what God is like. And here's what this text says in Daniel chapter 1. God delivers them over. In the Old Testament, we have over and over again God taking credit and blame for everything. God sends the flood. God tells Israel to destroy the Amalekites. God goes into Joshua and Judges and just destroys groups of people. God is doing it. But here in Daniel 1, we have the beginnings of another way of looking at it. God delivers them over. God lets them go. When we get to the New Testament, it is more clear. Romans 1 is very clear. What happens to the wicked who have gone against God? God gives them up. God lets them go. Romans 4:25, with Christ, who took all of our sins, God delivers him over. He lets him go. Matthew 27:46, Jesus Christ on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? God lets them go. It is not God killing Christ in our place, God pouring out his wrath. It is God letting go. And here we have these two different pictures. Many, many people, that's their primary picture of God. God is a God who, when people have sinned against him, just tells us, stand back, let me do what I'm going to do. His strange act of destroying people. But we have this other picture that God is letting go. God doesn't actually do that to people himself. He lets go. And they take the consequences of evil that they have gone through. You look through the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3, God doesn't kill. It is Babylon that throws people in the fiery furnace. Daniel 5, it is Medo-Persia that destroys all of the Babylonians. In Daniel 6, it is the lions that destroy, not God. It's always some other power. God lets them go. God lets them go. I got called to go down to Lake Elsinore, not far from us, the other day. I was taking a scuba class, and a man had died and drowned, and my scuba teacher was going to have to go do the search. I stood there and watched. The man had, I think, 9 or 11 children. They were out there on Father's Day having a great time when this man got drunk and made a terrible mistake and drowned. I watched at sundown as they pulled his body into a boat, as his family stood there and watched. I prayed with the mother. I'm so sorry. God let him go. He made his own choice. He got drunk and made a terrible decision. God lets people go. It is just the way it is. That in our world, whoever will be lost will not be lost because God destroys them, but because they have made choices that take you away from God of life. And God lets people suffer the natural consequences of what they have chosen. Number 5 are the moral choices. Here we have this great message in Daniel chapter 1. People think that you have to cut corners to get ahead, that you have to compromise. You can't live too pure. You have to break the rules. You have to bend the rules to get to the top. But not Daniel. He proposes a test. We'll eat our food according to our values, and the rest of them can eat according to the king's table. And let's just see who was going to win. You may think that doesn't really matter. Small little issue, a few things of food, doesn't really matter. But you look, Daniel 3, there's another test. Will you bow down to this image or not? Everyone who bowed down in Daniel 3 had already eaten at the king's table. Those who did not bow down did not eat at the king's table. Daniel 1 was a precursor and a marker in pointing a direction that plays out Daniel 3, Daniel 5, Daniel 6. Who you will be when there are bigger tests can be defined by who you are at the king's tables of our world. It may seem small at the beginning, but when you compromise at that level, then you become compromised to bigger and bigger levels. But if you pass that particular test, it becomes a moral beachhead that becomes a place to stand upon to go to the next level. C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity, page 117, good and evil both increase at compound interest. And so every level, every no becomes another no. And every yes to God becomes a strategic point to go stronger. You choose. You choose. And then finally becomes the ultimate point of this passage, that Daniel and his friends are 10 times better. It honored God. It didn't just honor God that they were living by his beliefs and not eating at the king's table. It honored God that they were 10 times better than everyone else. I used to pastor at a university. It matters. It honors God when we are better than the rest of the world because we have followed God's counsel. And there's natural consequences because we are better than everyone else. We are Daniels in the world. And Daniel, that enabled Daniel and his friends to become triumphant in the book of Daniel. That was their mission. Don't cheat your mission by compromise. Go for what God has called you to. Keep to your values and watch God bless you and make a difference and be a Daniel in the world. God bless you.